The vault didn't creak open. It detonated. Because this morning, the silence that wrapped Montecito like a luxury blanket was ripped apart by a single catastrophic rumor. A final, unredacted Maxwell list has surfaced, and it doesn't just whisper one royal name. It screams 8. And buried in the margins of that list, according to sources circling the legal debris, is a connection that makes palace walls sweat cold. This isn't another blind item. This isn't a coy headline floated to test public reaction. This is being framed by those close to the filings as a forensic moment, the kind that collapses narratives instead of feeding them. For years, stories were waved away as misogyny, conspiracy, jealous trolls. But today, the tone inside royal circles has shifted from dismissive to defensive. Because the allegation isn't about gossip anymore. It's about records. And records don't care about fairy tales. The panic isn't subtle. It's procedural. Insiders describe a sudden clampdown, phones quiet, aides frozen out, long-standing back channels abruptly sealed. This is the kind of lockdown reserved for existential threats. The kind you don't brief against, you contain. Why now? Why this list? Because for the first time, the rumor mill claims the paperwork doesn't just orbit one disgraced dupe. It allegedly sketches a network, 8 royals or royal-adjacent figures linked through social calendars, private clubs, yacht itineraries, and introductions that were never meant to be connected publicly. And one of those lines, sources insist, overlaps with the pre-royal years of a woman the institution welcomed without asking the one question it can never afford to skip: who vouched for you? For years, observers asked the same thing in different ways. How does a mid-tier cable actress with a respectable but unremarkable arsum circulate through spaces where privacy costs more than houses? How do the photos stack up? 5-star resorts, private events, jewelry that doesn't match a network TV paycheck? The official answer was hustle, timing, love, destiny. The whispered answer was access, and access always has a gatekeeper. The list, if it exists in the way sources describe, doesn't accuse. It maps. It traces who was present, who introduced whom, who hosted, who followed up. It allegedly shows patterns, the same locations, the same intermediaries, the same private members' clubs where anonymity is currency and favors are remembered. In those rooms, the difference between guest and asset is paperwork. This is why the palace is quiet today. Usually when a lie spreads, a denial blooms within hours. Friends brief. Spokespeople scoff. Legal letters flutter. Today, nothing. And in royal language, nothing is not neutral. It's a choice. Because the fear isn't about embarrassment, it's about vetting failure. Behind the scenes, the conversation has reportedly turned brutal. Not emotional, brutal. Who signed off? Who waved it through? Who decided the risk was acceptable because the optics were irresistible? The wedding dazzled the world, but some insiders are now asking whether it also blinded the institution to warning lights blinking red. And then there's the husband. Sources describe a man unraveling in slow motion, staring at screens, replaying timelines, trying to reconcile the story he fell in love with and the one being assembled without his consent. The savior narrative collapses hardest when the savior realizes he was never meant to save, he was meant to arrive. Because the list doesn't just name people, it names roles, hosts, introducers, fixers, facilitators. Why 8? Because, allegedly, that's the size of a circle that operated like a moving salon, stateless royals, untethered wealth, jurisdictions that don't ask questions, and a social rhythm that left paper trails only when someone wanted leverage. The list, sources say, is vengeance dressed as documentation, and it's landing at the worst possible moment. Inside the California mansion, the mood is described as funereal, staff rotations, new NDAs, curtains drawn, phones swapped. The sense that the old safety net, the friendly columnist, the sympathetic platform, the crisis firm that could drown a story in sentiment has gone thin because nobody wants to be anywhere near a name that could appear in the same paragraph as Maxwell. This is where the jewelry starts to matter, not as fashion, as receipts. Observers have long noted the diamonds that appeared early, the explanations that shifted, the provenance that blurred. Borrowed became gifted, gifted became misunderstood. The stories never quite lined up. In elite circles, jewelry is not decoration, it's signaling. It says who backs you, who expects access, who can call in a favor later. And if the list links certain donors to certain dates, the shine turns radioactive. The palace knows this. That's why this moment is being treated like a contamination event. Cut contact, reduce exposure, let the brand burn if it must, because institutions survive by sacrificing limbs. And that's the dread humming beneath the calm. Because if even one line on that list places a future duchess in the same room as a disgraced prince at a private gathering hosted by one of the 8, before the fairy tale ever began, the entire origin story implodes. The "I didn't know" defense withers. The warnings from an older brother start to look less like jealousy and more like intelligence briefings ignored. Today, the drawbridge is up. No statements. No comfort, no rescue. Just a realization spreading through Montecito like fog. When networks feel heat, they protect themselves first. Phones go dead. Invitations vanish. The oxygen thins. And the story that once sold itself as a romance begins to read like a recruitment. This is not the end. It's the intake. The machine doesn't collapse with noise. It collapses with coordination. Because while the public argues about headlines, inside the system the quiet work begins, the kind that doesn't trend, doesn't leak, and doesn't apologize. The kind designed to make sure only one side survives when the smoke clears. And according to multiple strands circling the same conclusion, that work began the moment the Maxwell list stopped being theoretical and started being operational. This is where the story turns from scandal to strategy. The 8 names aren't just names, they're nodes. Touch one and you light up the rest. And that's why the institution didn't rush to deny, because denial only works when the architecture is intact. Right now, the architecture is being audited. Follow the intermediaries. Every high-level social ecosystem has them. The men and women who never appear in headlines but appear in every photograph. The ones who arrange coincidental meetings, curate guest lists, smooth visas, and make sure the right people are seated close enough to exchange numbers without witnesses. In this case, the same intermediaries keep surfacing across years. Cities and events, private clubs, art openings, charity galas that look altruistic from the outside and transactional from the inside. That's why the list matters. It doesn't accuse, it correlates. And correlation is fatal when you're dealing with a monarchy that survives on plausibility. The fear in London isn't that the public will believe everything, it's that the public will believe enough. Enough to ask why the warnings were ignored. Enough to ask why certain background checks were rushed. Enough to ask why the institution bent over backward to accommodate a narrative that required constant reinforcement. Because narratives that are true don't need this much maintenance. Inside the California compound, the temperature has dropped. Sources describe frantic dialing, not to friends, but to fixers. Not to allies, but to handlers who used to make problems evaporate. The response has been chillingly uniform: silence, not refusal. Silence. That's how you know the asset has flipped into liability. And then there's the money trail, not the salaries, the subsidies. For years, analysts pointed out the arithmetic problem: the lifestyle didn't align with the income. Private flights, extended luxury travel, jewelry that appreciates instead of depreciates. The explanation was always vague: brand partnerships, generosity, luck. But the list reportedly includes expense facilitation markers, dates where costs were absorbed by third parties, hosts who never billed, trips that don't appear on standard manifests. If even a fraction of that aligns with publicly documented appearances, the story pivots hard, from success story to sponsored trajectory. And sponsorship always implies obligation. This is where the panic reaches the crown. Because once obligation exists, so does leverage. Inside royal law offices, attention has reportedly shifted to the one thing that overrides sentiment: succession integrity. The institution can survive embarrassment. It cannot survive ambiguity around legitimacy. And when a principal actor's credibility collapses, everything attached to them is reevaluated, not emotionally, but legally. That's why the conversation has turned colder. That's why compassion has given way to compliance language. The children. For years, they were treated as symbols, carefully curated, selectively revealed, deployed at moments of maximum PR need. Now, they're being reframed as variables, and variables are audited. The rumors that once lived on the fringe, questions about documentation, timelines, medical opacity, are no longer being laughed out of rooms. They're being placed on tables, quietly, with lawyers present. Because under succession rules, ambiguity isn't a philosophy problem, it's a constitutional one. And the mother knows it. That's why the shields are up. When institutions close ranks, individuals reach for what they still control. In this case, that control looks like access, silence, threats implied but not spoken, the suggestion that escalation would hurt everyone. But the problem with brinkmanship against a monarchy is this: they can wait you out. The extraction plan, according to those familiar with the mindset, isn't dramatic, it's methodical. all. Starve the narrative. Remove the oxygen. Let the liability isolate itself while offering the salvageable party a path back, quietly, privately, with conditions that feel less like forgiveness and more like probation. The marriage in this framework becomes irrelevant. What matters is containment. Observers note that the tone around the husband has shifted from accomplice to casualty. The language is subtle but deliberate, vulnerable, isolated, under influence. These aren't tabloid adjectives, they're legal ones. The groundwork for reframing has begun, and when reframing begins, the endgame is already chosen. Inside the mansion, the realization is reportedly dawning that the old playbook doesn't work anymore. Tears don't trend. Accusations don't stick. The audience has changed. They want documents, dates, receipts. The jewelry sits untouched now, not because it isn't beautiful, but because beauty has turned incriminating. You can't pawn it. You can't explain it. You can't pretend provenance doesn't matter when provenance is exactly what investigators trace. Every glittering surface reflects a past that won't stay buried. The final card, the one held back like a blade behind the wrist, is separation. Not as heartbreak, but as strategy. If executed correctly, it allows the institution to amputate without hemorrhaging. The husband returns. The titles freeze. The narrative resets around duty and rehabilitation. And the other party? She's left holding a story no one wants to publish. Because once the Maxwell stain touches you, it doesn't wash out. Corporations don't underwrite it. Platforms don't amplify it. Publishers don't gamble on it. You become too expensive to defend and too dangerous to promote. That's the real terror in Montecito tonight, not exposure, but irrelevance. A woman who built her power on visibility now faces a future defined by silence. No invitations, no allies, no sympathetic intermediaries willing to pick up the phone. Just the echo of a narrative that collapsed under its own weight. The monarchy will move on. It always does. The lights will glow in London. The line of succession will look orderly again. The institution will present continuity as if it were inevitability instead of survival. And thousands of miles away, the mansion will sit heavy and quiet, filled with objects that once signified assent and now signify evidence. This isn't a climax, it's a clearance. The Maxwell list didn't create the collapse, it accelerated it. It turned whispers into timelines and suspicion into structure. It forced a choice between sentiment and survival, and the Crown chose survival without hesitation. The simulation is ending, the access has been revoked, the network has dissolved into self-preservation, and history will not remember the story as a love affair gone wrong. It will remember it as a case study in what happens when someone mistakes proximity for immunity and learns too late that institutions don't love you back. They audit you back. They audit you back. They audit you back.